I think there were a couple of interesting findings that came up just by descriptively looking at who received modifications. The first is that the median modification length is like 1.7 years, which is a huge amount of time. So on average, patients are getting back 1.7 years of wait time on the wait list, when the average time waiting for a deceased donor kidney transplant is on the order of 3 to 5 years. That's like half of your time on the wait list.
I'm Eric, and this is Research Notes. In this episode, I talk with Dr. Rohan Khazanchi about his new paper with colleagues in JAMA Internal Medicine that takes a look at what happens when we remove race from the equations used to estimate kidney function. For a long time, the way that physicians were estimating kidney function made Black patients look healthier than they really were, which meant that they were much less likely to get kidney transplants and had to wait longer when they did get them. Dr. Khazanchi walks us through his analysis, which is interrupted time series, and talks about why it was the right analysis to answer the important causal questions at hand. I hope you enjoy our conversation. You have this very interesting paper in JAMA Internal Medicine, and I learned from it that until recently, the equations that doctors used to estimate kidney functions made it look like Black patients were healthier than they really are. And that meant longer time on the waiting list for a transplant and even less likely to get transplants overall. Tell us about this issue and when it changed and why you took an interest in studying it.
This is a really interesting problem in the field of medicine that has been known for a while, but didn't come to the forefront in the form of this sort of application in clinical algorithms until around 2020. And the problem that's been known for a while is that in biomedicine and American history, we have this predicament that's come up over and over again, where we've conflated social constructs like race and ethnicity with biological traits. And when I say that this has been going on for a while, I mean like W.E.B. Du Bois at the turn of the 20th century was writing about how, for some reason, people kept saying Black Americans are just less likely to be healthy because they're Black, when in reality, the conditions of their neighborhoods were the primary driver of their health. And so this is like a conversation we've been having since W.B. Du Bois in the late 1900s, right? But these applications in clinical algorithms sort of happened under the radar and in a way that most of us that practice medicine missed. And this is because really as clinicians, these are tools that help us shortcut to diagnostic information or categorizing or staging a disease. But these tools exist across every organ system in the body pretty much. So in 2020, we were having this racial justice conversation in medicine writ large. I was actually living in Minneapolis. I was very close to where George Floyd was shot and killed. So I was seeing it in my community too, not to mention having lived in St. Louis before that, where Mike Brown was killed. And so I was really there during the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement, and myself identifying that interest and commitment to social justice is a key reason why I went into the field of medicine. And at the same time, to see that conversation in the field sort of shift, where a big paper came out in the New England Journal of Medicine that named clinical algorithms specifically by organ system, talking about pulmonary function testing, eGFR, vaginal birth after cesarean section, calculators for fracture risk, all of these that seem to have some application of race being operationalized as a biological construct and used to predict clinical risk of an outcome, when in reality we know that race may be a proxy for all those exposures that come with being of a certain racial group in the United States. It's structural racism, right? The exposure really is. So eGFR was one example of that, this equation to calculate kidney function. And it was because they had done some studies in the late 90s and then again in the mid 2000s to predict measured kidney function, which we do in a research setting by being able to measure a protein in the blood that's completely cleared into the urine. And it's this like fancy research test, right, that you could never use as a doctor because you're not going to spend 24 hours carefully measuring somebody's kidney function. You need a proxy that at the bedside you could use that day. And the proxy we got is this lab test called creatinine that happened to have some variability by racial groups. And in these studies, when they saw that variability, they said, let's put a race adjustment in this equation so that Black patients end up with a different estimation of their kidney function than non-Black patients. And the original study, the MDRD in 1999, said something to the effect of, we wonder if this might be because there's different muscle mass between the two groups, and creatinine is a byproduct of muscle breakdown. So it was these assumptions that sort of got baked into the original research that ended up leading to a kind of half plausible biological explanation, later debunked with more research on this muscle mass theory, we were left with. It was stuck in the equations. And those equations are used for chronic kidney disease staging, for deciding when to refer somebody to a nephrology specialist, for this cutoff of an eGFR of 20 that leads to somebody being waitlisted for kidney transplant. And really, the time that you're waitlisted for transplant is a key determinant of when you get transplanted, because if you accumulate more time on the waitlist, your priority status moves up. And so we recognized that this was super important, right? And eventually the kidney specialists agreed to change the algorithm. There was national research as well as outcry from student organizers like myself at the time and other activists in the field who said this doesn't seem right just based on what we know about race being a social construct. But the algorithm changed, and we were left with figuring out how to address the consequences for people who had been staged with this old algorithm for years. And so this study stepped in at that point of the initial reparative intervention, which was for the first time, the National Transplant Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network said people who are disadvantaged by those old equations can get time back on the wait list. They can get time added to their wait list registration on the basis of what their GFR would have been, or when it would have crossed 20 if we had been using this race neutral equation that we're now using the whole time.
So this isn't some error in a regression equation. This is a real algorithmic harm that came from years of using a race-informed algorithm. What I loved most about this story is that it wasn't just changing the algorithm going forward. It was saying, we're going to go back, and it's a bit of restorative justice here, and give people, like you said, time back on. So that was what, 2021, 2020, something like that?
Exactly. So the algorithm changed basically because the National Kidney Foundation, American Society of Nephrology, shifted their recommendations for which eGFR equation to use in 2021. But then basically the transplant folks said, well, oh crap, like we can change this moving forward. But as you said, what about the folks who we've already harmed by continuing to use this race-based equation? And that's where this reparative restorative justice intervention of time back on the wait list came in.
And when did you and your team first have the idea that you could actually estimate the impact of this change?
Yeah, I was a first-year resident here in Boston, and Martha Pavlikis, who's the senior author on this study, is actually not a huge clinical researcher, but is the medical director of the transplant program at a different hospital here in town, Beth Israel Deaconess. And Martha and I knew each other because she was on the board of directors for the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network at the time that they implemented this reparative policy. So I knew Martha was like intimately involved in those conversations, and probably more than anybody knew exactly the nuances of what this was going to do to affect somebody's waitlist status on the transplant list, and really what it was going to do to the population of people on the transplant waitlist writ large. And so I came in as somebody with quantitative methods training and somebody who is a health services researcher, but has been in this space as an advocate for almost a decade now, it seems. And I said, Martha, we could do this study. We just need to figure out how to get the data from OPTN. And from what I can tell looking online, they have publicly available data. So if they can tell us about who got wait time modifications and who didn't, and just give us a little bit of information about people's transplant outcomes, we should be able to do this study in a way that's pretty rigorous and makes ideally a causal claim about shifts in transplant patterns by racial and ethnic group on a national scale. And so Martha was pretty helpful in moving these connections around and talking with folks, but really any researcher, as you learned, Eric, from reaching out yourself, can get access to these data from the national transplant folks.
I was going to ask you how you did it, but then I did it myself. And I think 3 days later, the files are on my computer, which is surprising for medicine and public health. It's often, for sometimes good reasons, sometimes obscure reasons, it can be hard to get data. So you get your hands on this. And at what point are you thinking now, okay, I know what analysis I'm going to do? Did your team have to mull this over and consider different approaches?
We mulled this over for a long time. I actually remember sitting down with Aaron Fleischman, who's the statistician that I worked with on actually constructing the analysis. And I said I wanted to do a difference in differences because that was my first inclination. It's a nice, clean, single causal estimand that just tells you the number of people who moved one way or another. Like that would have been my ideal study design.
Interesting.
And eventually we presented an initial version of this work, which was the difference in differences version at a national conference. We started drafting the paper, and Again, more conversations happened as we got into the peer review process. And somewhere along the way, we realized, you know what, a diff and diff actually doesn't work for this type of outcome because it's a zero-sum outcome, an outcome where even if you change the transplant rate for one group, it's going to directly affect the transplant rate for the other group, and that violates the stable unit treatment variation assumption. So we had this interesting problem where we were like, a diff and diff makes total sense because it's clean, but we might have to do the more complicated thing, which is a non-controlled ITS, on the basis of trying to get to the right answer without violating the assumptions of a diff and diff analysis.
I don't love it for you, but I love it for the story of this because you got all the way through, it sounds like, presenting the results of one particular analysis only to realize, maybe from reviewer feedback, I don't know how you figured that out, but that actually this is not the right way to do it. But the ultimate outcome was a really great paper published in a pretty solid journal.
Yeah, I have to say I learned more from, the peer review process for many reasons was helpful for this paper, but I learned more from the comments our reviewers gave us, comments I heard from colleagues at conferences from this particular paper than from anything I've ever submitted before. I think this was just an example of a paper that was actually molded by feedback I got along the way. And the other thing is, I think our team was so wonderful. Ken Michelson is one of the middle authors on this paper, and he's a pediatric ER doctor. So you can imagine how crazy it was for me to call up Ken and say, hey, Ken, I know this has absolutely nothing to do with anything you usually study, but you're a methods expert and you do great health services research. And Ken and I have worked together before on a regression discontinuity study on drug shortages.
You're hitting all the quasi-experimental designs.
I know. This is what I've been trying to do over the last couple of years, is just make sure I have good understanding of them all, because I think these are really useful methods with creative use of observational data to be able to answer causal questions that matter for policymakers. These are the types of studies that I love to do, but Ken has great facility and ability to think through data sources and questions and answer these sort of assumptions problems with tact and with a smart set of ideas. So Ken and I sat down and I was like, I just need you to look at this analysis and help me think this through. And between him, Aaron, myself, James, who's done a lot of work in the race-based medicine space too, we were able to construct something that we felt answered all the questions we needed to answer. We put some sensitivity checks in there, which you've seen in the supplement, and we made sure that we tried to do this in as many ways as possible to answer those possible critiques, because we knew that this policy itself is a very controversial one. It's one that's on a national level and has a huge impact on a scarce resource. And so to us, answering the question in a precise way where that actual number, that actual estimate that you get on the other end is correct, it really mattered to us.
Talk us through the analysis here, the interactive time series design. Let's review the setup and your steps as you're thinking through the analysis, and of course the headline finding.
An ITS design helps you see two main estimands on the other end, as compared to a difference in differences where you get this single number on the other side. For an ITS, we'll get a level change, which is the immediate change after a policy is implemented, looking at two lines, one in the pre-period, one in the post-period, that are fit to the data in the pre and post period, or comparing that level change or that change in intercept at the time the policy was implemented. The second outcome of an ITS is the slope change. So comparing the pre-implementation slopes and the post-implementation slopes. And in our study, we did a non-controlled ITS design, which means we didn't inherently include a comparison group in our regression models. We actually modeled the ITS for separate groups, meaning for Black patients, for non-Black patients, and then in the supplement, we stratified out by individual racial and ethnic groups. The other important thing to know about our design is we included a washout period of about 3 months. And I think that was important because we didn't want to underestimate the effect of the policy by accounting for an intercept change at a time when very few people were getting wait time modifications.
So just because a policy is put into place doesn't mean that the next day people are coming off the wait list, right? It took some time for that to materialize.
Yeah, we knew that in January of 2023, when this was first implemented, transplant centers had a massive amount of work to do, right? They were told they had to review their entire transplant waiting list. They had to go back and find old EGFR values for as many patients as possible that were eligible for modifications. And then they had to submit those modification requests to the national transplant folks and have them approve them. And so what we saw when we looked descriptively at number of wait time modifications approved over time, it took about 3 months before that number really hit a peak and started to roll through that first year. The full effect of the policy didn't kick in until 1 year in. We estimated, based on our use of different washout intervals, that 3 months was probably a conservative estimate, but gave us a reasonable idea of the intercept change associated with the policy. And then really, as we got closer to like 6 or 9 months, we saw actually an even larger intercept change, which is not the main effect we presented in our study. So all this to say, I think that washout interval, or that notion that when you implement a policy, it doesn't always work right away, is really important to think about in ITS and differences designs, because that determines the cut point at which you're comparing the pre and post periods. So for us, we felt like the 3 month made sense.
And, this design is data hungry, right? You need enough data from before this policy change or intervention, and then enough time afterwards. So you're doing this analysis in 24, 25?
We started the analysis midway through 2025. Yeah. So we
So
had
you had
about
several
a
years
year
of
and a half of
implementation. Yeah.
post-implementation data. We had several years of pre, and then we kept updating our data as we worked through the analysis and submitted revisions, because we wanted to use as much of that post period as we could to see what was happening.
What surprised you most when you ran the models and took a look at everything?
One thing that surprised me was just how parallel the pre and post intervention slopes were. They were essentially the same between groups. I was expecting that there would at least be some secular trend in transplant outcomes that was affecting one group more than the other. Really, what we saw is that level change was pretty much the explainer of the secular trend. There was some increase in transplant volume, and that increase in volume primarily went to Black patients at the time they received modifications. But after that, there was kind of parallel slopes in the post period. So we didn't see a regression to the mean where the two groups sort of converged. And then similarly in the pre-period, the two groups had exactly the same trend of increasing transplant volume as we came out of the COVID pandemic. So I thought that was really interesting. And the ITS helped us identify that in a way that difference in differences may not have.
Yeah, and it's so visual, right? To be able to see it, you get this jump, and then it kind of starts to change direction. I understood that to be that after the restoration has been done for the patients who were eligible for it, or at least had access to it, then you see that go away. But it was the immediate effect.
Right. There was this bolus effect that we saw, which is that many patients received modifications off the bat. The number of patients receiving modifications has not gone to zero yet, because some patients are still being newly listed or are becoming eligible for modifications because their centers are identifying older values a little bit later in the game. But nonetheless, it seems like a huge number of patients benefited in that first year of policy implementation, and perhaps the effects of that are now starting to wane off. Now, we haven't seen a total regression to the mean yet, where both groups are doing the exact same thing, but it'll be interesting to see how this continues to unfold in the years ahead.
It does seem that it had a really meaningful impact for the folks who were able to get access to this time back, but not everybody was, or at least not everybody has been yet. So the work's not done, right?
Exactly. So yeah, I think there were a couple of interesting findings that came up just by descriptively looking at who received modifications. The first is that the median modification length is like 1.7 years, which is a huge amount of time. So on average, patients are getting back 1.7 years of wait time on the wait list, when the average time waiting for a deceased donor kidney transplant is on the order of 3 to 5 years. That's like half of your time on the wait list that we're talking. And for some patients, the maximum amount of time that an individual received back was 21.2 years. And I asked Martha, I said, Martha, you're a transplant nephrologist. How on earth could somebody get 21 years back on the kidney transplant wait list? And she told me this story about a patient of hers who had been incarcerated for over a decade, and that while he was incarcerated, he couldn't be listed for kidney transplant, but eventually made it back to the clinic to see her. And she said, that's a patient who now, against all odds, is getting 13, 14 years back on the kidney transplant wait list. So it's pretty unbelievable to think about those edge cases too, that were all the way on the right side of our distribution when we just looked at amount of time people received back. There are some unique stories there that I'm curious to hear more about if folks identify those. But I think the other piece that really mattered to us and was interesting is that a large proportion of Black candidates did not actually receive any wait time modification. And that could be for a number of reasons, but I think the important reasons are the ones directly related to the policy for us. One is that maybe some centers that have a large proportion of Black candidates were less able to identify those older values. They couldn't dig in as deep. Their patients had less access to old records. I don't know exactly, right? For some reason, they had a hard time getting to old lab values that could have been used for a modification submission. I think the second reason is clinically, I've seen patients that come into the hospital and the first time they're diagnosed with kidney disease is when they're in acute renal failure. They come in, they're super sick, and they do what's called crashing onto dialysis. We come into the hospital just so ill with many signs of renal failure, and we end up initiating dialysis that admission. Those patients are not patients who would likely benefit from this policy, even if they're eventually waitlisted for kidney transplant, because they are not patients who are going to have a bunch of old lab values. So I do worry about if that is a more marginalized patient population in other ways, that's just less likely to benefit from a reparative intervention that's based on having access to care and having old lab values. These were things we were thinking about and we wrote
Yeah.
about a little bit in the discussion of the paper. I think it's a hard problem to solve with this intervention. I think this intervention still matters and seems to have had benefit for redressing a harm, but we have to think about who's been left behind.
I have to say, you explained your paper so well. It was a real joy to read. When it came in my inbox, I thought, oh man, this is the example of uninterrupted time series design that I'm going to put to my trainees. Such an important topic, and it's really well done. So the last question I have for you is, you're in medicine, but you're also taking a tour through all of the quasi-experimental designs out there. How did you get to where you are? What's your path?
I have had a confusing and winding path. As an
Those are the best.
undergrad, thought I was going to be a basic scientist. I was doing bench research in a neurobiology lab, and I had this interest in neurodevelopment and autism, and had personal experiences with kids and other folks with neurodevelopmental issues, and thought that was the path I was going down, was like PhD researcher in the lab. And honestly, it was this social justice stuff that I talked about, in particular, the killing of Mike Brown in St. Louis, as well as the fact that I returned home to Nebraska, where I grew up, for medical school, that pushed me back into the health equity research, clinical research, health services research domain. And that's because the questions that stuck out to me that felt most pertinent to people's health, to the health of the communities that I was hanging out with and talking to, were always questions of social issues and of social determinants of health. And so for me, it was inextricable to my medical training that I needed to have an understanding of how I could do more than just take care of patients in front of me, but work on a population scale to improve health disparities. As a medical student, I tried to get involved in research. I did a little bit of work in HIV disparities at our local HIV clinic that I was working at. But I was really frustrated because I got tired of having to call a statistician and say, hey, can you download the data, run all the analysis for me, tell me what you found. We'll do some back and forth over and over again to try to get to the right place. I was like, why don't I just learn this stuff
Right.
myself so I can tinker with the data my own way? And that may have been a little naive because I did definitely bite off more than I could chew. I took on some data projects that I couldn't handle and had to make some mistakes and crash and burn a few analyses. But I ended up seeking a master's of public health at the University of Minnesota, focused on quantitative methods training, got involved in a ton of cool projects while I was up in Minneapolis, and then parlayed that into a residency where I'm working mostly as a clinician. My job is 110% clinical right now, but I've tried to pick up a few research projects along the way that would allow me to expand my methods toolkit. And now I'm on the clinician investigator path. I'm planning on being a health services researcher. I'm going into a fellowship that's going to give me 80% protected time for research over
Amazing.
the next 2 years. So I love taking care of patients. That's very much still the reason I did this. But
Yeah.
being able to translate that patient care experience into really thoughtful research questions is also something that matters.
Well, I can't wait to see your next project.
Thanks, Eric.